Unless you're mixing your music in an open field, mixing with headphones, or have thick absorbers all over your studio, there's a good chance that there's a ridiculous difference in the levels of the various frequencies in your studio, especially the bass ones, even if you're using near-field speakers. IK Multimedia just released iLoud Sub. It attempts to solve two problems. First, to add low-end frequencies to near-field monitors or to small satellite speakers, and second, to apply room correction across the range so that a sweep of frequencies across your room doesn't look like this and hopefully looks like this. But does it actually work well? I measured it so you can see for yourself in this video. Before I start, a quick disclosure. IK sent me iLoud Sub. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, first let's try and understand the problems that iLoud Sub tries to solve. And you can measure this in your own studio with free software called Room EQ Wizard. This is a sweep of my room where I just don't want to allocate space for massive absorbers before applying room correction. As you can see, I've got 2 or 3 nasty bass modes and a dip here and dips here. This means, by the way, that playing a simple bass A note will sound more than twice as loud than a D note in the same octave. There's almost a 14 or 15 dB difference between this low and this high. This just isn't how you want to make music or make mixing decisions, and the physical pressure these modes create isn't enjoyable. By the way, if you think near-field speakers don't have this problem, this is a sweep of the iLoud MTMs without the subwoofer, and without their correction, of course, you can see that there's about a 14 or 15 dB difference here. So besides plenty of thick absorbers or using headphones, there are 2 other ways to alleviate this problem. The first is exploring different speaker and listening positions, which you should, but is beyond the scope of this video. And the second is applying room correction, meaning using a system that measures these peaks and valleys and then applies an EQ curve or filter to balance them out, or at least reduce them. Now, I already made a video about how to do this using the free Room EQ Wizard software and other paid solutions. I'll link to it below. The problem with software-based solutions is that you've got to remember to add them when you mix and remove them when you export, or use system-wide plugins that add latency, and software solutions won't work for DAW-less setups that don't go through a computer. Things get even more complex when adding a subwoofer into the mix, because now besides correction, you've got to be mindful of the crossover frequencies between the sub and the speakers to adjust levels between them and to account for potential phase issues. That's why we're increasingly seeing hardware solutions for these problems, either in the form of speakers with built-in correction or standalone devices you pass your audio through. The interesting thing about iLoud Sub is that it applies room correction not just to its own audio, but also to any 2 speakers you connect to it, while also managing a seamless crossover between the 3. The sub is relatively small and it's designed to be paired with near-field speakers like IK's own iLoud Micro or iLoud MTM, but also any other speaker pair from any brand. It both relieves them of low-frequency duties that might be a stretch for their size, and of course extends their bass to reach sub-frequencies. It'll also apply room correction to all 3, even if whatever speaker or satellite pair you choose doesn't have room correction at all. Looking at its back panel, it accepts a stereo input pair that it feeds through to the satellites. You can use either balanced or unbalanced cables, and I don't recommend using unbalanced connections. iLoud Sub also supports Bluetooth connectivity, and while you can set its crossover frequency manually, that really isn't the point. You want to pair it with IK's ArcX software, which you do over USB. iLoud Sub also comes bundled with this measurement mic and this little holder for it. You'll want to place these on a mic stand when you make measurements so that it doesn't move. It comes with a USB cable and power cable, but you'll need an audio interface with phantom power for the microphone and all the proper cables balanced, preferably like I mentioned, in order to hook your computer up to the sub and the sub to the speakers. Let's take a quick look at the ArcX software. After you calibrate the software, which we'll talk about in a bit, you'll see a sweep of the room, both before correction and an estimation of what the curve will look like after correction. If you're curious, you can also break it down by speaker, so left, right, and sub before correction and post-correction. Even if your satellites go below the crossover point, it's going to cut them off at whatever crossover point you choose, which is a good thing because the more sub duties you can offload from the small speakers, the better. By the way, these sweeps also show you why it's not a good idea to just add a subwoofer to your system without applying room correction. So this is the audio sweep of just the subwoofer standalone. You can see it's not really doing much in many of the low-end frequencies. We'll see in a bit whether it actually manages to cover these frequencies, like it says it will. Regardless, the lesson is don't just add a subwoofer to your system without correction and or treatment. It might just make things worse. Okay, so these sweeps and measurements don't just appear. You need to go through the calibration process. This only takes a few minutes. It's just 7 sweeps at various ear level locations around your listening position. Once done, the ArcX software automatically configures your speakers in a few interesting ways. So we already saw the frequency-based corrections it's going to apply to each of the 3 speakers. Besides that, ArcX also applies gain correction to each of the 3 speakers and even applies delays to the speakers to correct for phase or timing issues. Note that while the software defines everything, the magic happens inside the speaker. Audio isn't going through the computer, and you don't need to have the software on for this to work. You can toggle correction on and off to hear the difference between having it and not having it. You've got a few target curves that you can explore. And you can also have the system simulate one of multiple different speaker types. You can see the curve change sort of in behind there. Even simulate a smartphone, in which case you really shouldn't have bought a subwoofer because this is what you'll hear. Joking aside though, this is very useful in simulating different environments your mix may be listened at. So sure, you won't hear any bass in this case, but you'll hear what your music sounds like on a phone. And of course, you can always go back to the default. So does this post-room correction curve actually work? This is nice in theory. Let's check out a few sweeps I made of my room. As you can see, I did quite a few of these tests. Let's first take a look at, say, the right speaker without room correction. And this is the left speaker without correction. Pretty similar situation. And then left speaker with calibration and right speaker with calibration. I don't know about you, but this is pretty insane to me. So again, before, a huge difference between the peaks and the valleys, and after, if we say look at the average over here, it goes as bad as about 3 decibels below and 3 decibels above, which is not too shabby at all. You'll notice there's a bit of a roll off here towards 25 hertz. Let's take a look at the right side again. Maybe a bit less pronounced here. So maybe not exactly in line with the prediction of about 1.5 dB above the average, and maybe -3 below. So that's pretty much it for iLoud Sub. Let's talk about pros and cons. On the pros side, iLoud Sub is a great way to supplement the frequency response of small near-field speakers that don't go all the way down to 35, 30, and 25 hertz. Listening to music with it is both more fun and a more accurate way to judge your sound, and it's a difference you feel, which never hurts. I think it's a decent alternative to replacing small speakers with much bigger ones. You can just stick this under your desk, preferably, by the way, in the center, and get a substantial upgrade to your sound without giving up much real estate. It's also a great way to add correction to any satellite pair that doesn't have built-in DSP room correction. So if the lack of room correction was the only reason you were considering replacing your speakers, then with iLoud Sub, you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You get bass frequencies and hardware room correction for your existing speaker pair. On the cons side, I can only really think of one, and that's price. A pair of iLoud MTMs, which I think are great on their own, cost about $700. The iLoud Micros, which also aren't too shabby, around $280. To add on top of that an expense of $600, at least as of the making of this video, is quite a bit. But maybe by the time you're watching this, prices have gone down a bit. I'll add price check links below. Then beside that, one important note that applies to any speaker or subwoofer you get, not just iLoud Sub, is that even if you do get a major frequency response improvement like we saw in this video, room EQ correction doesn't solve the problem of the time that it takes for certain frequencies to decay. As you add more bass, you add more bass frequencies that can take time to decay without large bass traps. That said, by reducing the level of these resonant peaks, iLoud Sub helps improve the situation. If you're like me and prefer to have more synths than drywall in your room, just be aware of this problem and compare your mix in headphones to make sure you get it right. Then on the wishlist side, there's no way currently to turn correction on or off or to choose the different correction profile other than doing that in the software. It would be great if you could MIDI map these, say perhaps to have a few profiles you switch back and forth to and from, so that if you're making DAW-less music or mixing in a DAW, you don't have to go back and forth into and out of the ArcX software just to switch profiles. So that's it for iLoud Sub. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.